Yeah, I mean, we definitely want to touch every type of aspect in this workshop, you know, the social, the human rights, the economical, every single part. But when you mentioned the part about the structure of it, when it's really strategic research and conflict mineral, an approach we've thought about really strongly is about when a country experiences a strong foreign direct investment. We've considered that that's when it can be categorized as a conflict mineral in a way, because in a way it shows that that government doesn't have the leverage to be able to exploit that natural resource. So that's when the international community becomes really worried and aware that it might be a conflict mineral. Say, for example, when Russia, in the Soviet Union, it was a very powerful nation. It had the leverage to be exploiting different natural resources, uranium. For them, it could be a strategic resource because they can acknowledge that it's their government handling this. So in many African regions, you have many different global companies being the ones extracting those natural resources. So that's when, for many people, that becomes a conflict mineral. There's no government actually controlling that process. So it becomes something very dangerous for everybody, like in the global community. So that's a point we've been thinking about.
So if I can clarify, you're thinking that when foreign direct investment happens, that's a clue.
When foreign direct investment happens at a level where the government pretty much just steps aside and it's really the international companies handling the whole extraction process, that's when you, in a way, can have the educated assumption that a conflict mineral might be.
But I'm afraid that that assumes that that means it's somehow a weak government, and I think that I'm not well versed in what the definition of foreign direct investment is, but today's multinationals, 20 or 30 of them are bigger than
Governments.
Yeah. So multinationals operate in developed countries, and developed nations use foreign direct investment, I think. But they certainly have multinationals because that's where the expertise is.
Yeah.
So I'm a little wary of saying that that's a tip-off.
Well, I mean, we're seeing it this way. When there's that natural resource in, say, that country obviously is an emerging economy. It doesn't have the infrastructure to be able to extract natural resources like that. It allows many different companies like this that you mentioned, those 20 or 30 companies, to come to their nation and actually have the control of that extraction. Well, that in a way worries because, you know, the purpose of business is clearly to be profitable, give shareholders.
Sure.
So in that way, there's no guarantee in like the human rights, the corporate social responsibility, that it will occur in that extraction. So that's when a potential conflict mineral may arise. If it was actually a government, and a government, as you know, has to respect and, you know, protect every citizen, there would be those elements included there, like being in charge of protecting that everything will take place in order.
Well, I think Nigeria gives the lie to that with the oil curse.
Well, the natural course, yeah. Well, in that case, we do have those type of
responsibly behaving government.
Yeah, in that case, we do have those types of, you know, different exceptions. But in general, that's a part, in my particular part of this research, I'm analyzing that part. Is how that FDI plays into maybe that categorization of a conflict mineral or strategic
But then
resource.
you're suggesting that maybe a country should mine itself, do the mining itself.
If it has the leverage.
But it just may not have the expertise.
Well,
or
yeah.
the experience.
Or the interest.
Why not bring in a
could be there.
multinational that is good at it?
Well, because then you reach that authority. The government, in a way, loses that authority when you just allow a foreign company to come to your country and
Not
do that.
if we teach governments how to manage foreign nationals.
The issue
is
with
the goal of teaching, but that never really happens in reality.
That's a good question.
I think a lot of industrialized nations, or however you want to term the first world, the North, whatever, they do manage foreign multinationals. There are standards in place. There is something called the Global Compact at the UN.
There's a lot of studies that show, though, that foreign direct investment is one of the least regulated, even amongst the most wealthy nations. Particularly because, and foreign direct investment we can define in the turn of the 1980s, you had companies that started to realize that if you purchase outright certain elements of either a resource or a company, you then can internalize that behavior. And there was no precedent for being able to regulate that type of behavior. As a very short acronym in the business school, we teach OLI, ownership, localization, and internalization properties. That's what defines foreign direct investment. But there's no real evidence to this day, even amongst the most sophisticated regulatory instruments, that foreign direct investment can and will be regulated in any significant way. One example of that you can see on the board. If we were to look at not necessarily foreign direct investment, but if you look at the majority of the states where uranium mining took place in the United States in the 1930s all the way to the 1960s, you can start to see there's a relationship between those states and their regulatory sophistication at the time. And so they were heavily exploited, particularly because there was no way for resource allocation to have a meaningful discourse in the legal arena. So there is a direct relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's a cause or a primary clue, but it is a function. For sure, it's an institutional function. Yes?
You know, as you show this, I want to kind of, say something else about my background, since the folks that I'm an epidemiologist, and I study the causes and distribution and determinants of diseases and populations. And so one of the things that I really try to get people to understand is we need to look at root causes of these issues. Otherwise, we're spending a lot of time and energy doing damage control. Yeah. So we have to start looking upstream at different types of policies and things. And as you mentioned this, I thought about, okay, you mentioned the financial issues, and I thought, okay, we really have to talk about the global political economy, in that regard. And in that sense, you do need more research and more discussion about the international, foreign exchange system, how it exists. And through the conversations that you were having a few moments ago, remind me of two things: the Washington Consensus and something else that's coming now called the Beijing Consensus. And when you mentioned that issue, you talked about leverage, and that reminded me that's pretty much where the Beijing Consensus is coming from. That less developed nations have little power and access to leveraging these things. And so that's becoming a predominant discussion now in government and financial circles about what that means and how you look at any of these issues. Now, one of the criticisms of the Beijing Consensus is that one person called it the Silicon Valley development model, which is a scary thought too as we talk about conflict minerals, So, but those are the type of conversations we have to have, do we continue to work with this notion of the free trade and the Washington Consensus model, or do we move towards the Beijing Consensus model with its self-determination and other issues that are under play there? And I think this is maybe one of the things why, folks who adhere to the Washington Consensus are so much afraid of what's happening with Chinese investment right now happening in Africa as well. I don't know if you've ever read Brzezinski's book, The Global Chessboard. The Grand Chessboard. Take a look at that, where they've redrawn all kinds of maps of what the world should look like from South Asia, Southwest Asia, and the rest of the world, in order to covet those resources because of national security, in order to keep the Indian continent, subcontinent, and the Chinese nation, People's Republic of China. I know some people still argue whether there's a two-nation, two-China policy or not, but to keep their economies from growing as fast as they're doing.
Other documents, while we're talking about theories or documents that come into play here, are the ILO Convention 169, and that is ostensibly about talking about indigenous rights to consultation. Now, they use the word consultation for these very purposes. The proponents of it wanted the word consensus to be in there, that you have to have the locals' consensus on what you're doing. And only 20 nations have signed it, which is very, very small. It's a treaty. But it says that you have to have consultation with the locals. The indigenous have rights. Now, it gets complicated because which group? Maybe somebody self-identifies as a representative, and the company says, hey, we consulted. And the rest of the group says, not with us, you didn't. But anyway, so ILO 169 you should be aware of. We've been very slow in coming with indigenous rights. There's a declaration of development, the right to development. Again, it's just a declaration. It didn't make it into a convention status or a treaty status. But the Declaration on the Right to Development also addresses those ideas of what participation of, a lot of them go in to say, we're going to develop your country, we're going to develop your mind, we're going to develop your resources. Well, meanwhile, you're shoving people off the land and abusing them and enslaving them and everything else. So those are guides to these discussions. I think there's a declaration on indigenous rights, too. So again, these are weak instruments. But it is the world body coming together at the UN and writing these. These are not Western documents. These are coming out of indigenous folks themselves, saying how they want to be treated.